Hello, I'm Brian Kelley. I'm a visiting instructor of drawing at the College of William and Mary, and this is late February 2013. So I guess the starting question is one of how did I come to do what I'm doing right now, to do something like painting? I think there were many other interests I had, throughout childhood and adolescence and so on. But there was something about understanding architectural space, spaces that people live in, inventing that space, something that's very visual and geometric that has always kind of really appealed to me. And I've also found over the years that the kind of work I'm doing, more than if I had kind of focused on maybe something in the way of writing or music or another creative art, other arts that I really like a lot, this is the one that I was able to most synthesize other ideas with. So interestingly, I'm the visiting instructor here. I was actually a student at William and Mary in undergrad. So some of the professors that I'm working with were actually kind of instrumental in terms of kind of shaping some of the things I do now, suggesting people for me to look at. So I think it might be worth kind of mentioning some of that part of the backstory in more detail, because a lot of this show has been geared towards really an undergraduate audience in the scope of this is somebody who actually went through this program. This has been, my story. So coming into William and Mary as an undergrad, probably the biggest artist I was looking at was Mondrian. I was really interested in like high geometric, non-representational, modernist painting. I was very interested in the way that Mondrian would have these asymmetrical compositions. There would be this incredible amount of tension, the way that he could balance one like tiny red square in the corner against like a blue and a yellow rectangle on opposite sides. Something that would have a great amount of balance without any degree of symmetry to it at all, but also like very clear rules. There was something very appealing to me about finding a painter like Mondrian that it took him years and years and years to kind of winnow out what was really interesting. So in his early career, he's painting piers, he's doing Dutch landscapes, he's slowly compressing his palette, he's slowly condensing his marks, he's finally realizing he doesn't need actually anything in the representational world. And then he finds these ideas of balance that I found so powerful. So I have all these formal ideas coming in to William and Mary, but then I don't really know how to draw too well. And one of the things that was really interesting about this program is this is very much in this two-dimensional studio realm of people like Brian Credatus and Bill Barnes and Linda Carey, Neil Riley. These were people I studied with here. They cared very much about working from perception, working directly from nature. I got to spend a lot of time working from the figure, doing model sessions, and ultimately I kind of took all these formal ideas that I had for a long time, an interest in like the pure geometry and invention, but rediscovered kind of the joy of working from something direct in the world instead of creating this kind of vacuum existence that had no immediate ties. So then I get to something like this piece here, and this is a compound view of two different residences. One an apartment I had in Alexandria, Virginia, and also my current apartment in Williamsburg, Virginia. Some of the pieces in the show kind of came about from the fact that I had things that I just didn't finish when I moved for the beginning of this Williamsburg job. So what do? I would kind of paint over the half that I didn't like as much. I'd leave the half I liked more, and I would start to invent the architecture that way. If the light wasn't working, very often I'll start them at one time of day, finish them at another. If it starts in the daytime, usually the nocturnes start to have really strange kind of cast light that doesn't necessarily refer to anything that was observed. So these ideas of the formal ways of composing, the ideas of inventing, they appear, but they don't appear immediately. I'm starting from perception, and then as I'm seeing issues, formal issues that aren't working in the real world, that's when the inventing comes in. The other, to kind of go back to why did I become a painter instead of doing something more in another creative art? Because in many ways I still think it would be great if I had more time in the world, and then I could have pursued a whole bunch of other parallel disciplines. These spaces come in many ways from the domestic space of the places that I live, the places that I inhabit, the ideas that are actually kind of manifest in them. Before the interview, Peter, you were talking about visiting the house of Susan Webster, and how it's this kind of living museum where you live with these works from Ecuador and Central America, and you start to understand the ideas better just because they're in the kitchen, they're in the living room, they're down the hallway to the bedroom. A lot of the ideas of the world, I think, like if I can get them into my apartment, so I actually have to live with them, that's what's going to help me always have it in the back of my mind, constantly thinking about it. You know, so just as an anecdotal example, this is a painting that I'm doing over the middle of the winter. I get an onion, I get a bag of onions. Some of the onions start to sprout in package, and so all of a sudden I'm thinking about the fact that this is happening at a time of the year when the light's very cold. This is a painting that started in the daytime, and now it's kind of really eerily at night. And I have produce that's actually starting to kind of want to get into a spring kind of mindset, even though it's very cold. And so this bulb is around in my kitchen for weeks before I put it into the painting. But I'm walking past it, you know, all the time. I'm working on this painting. I'm going to make a meal. I see the onion, and then finally it becomes a content idea that goes back into the painting, and it also becomes a formal way of addressing the fact that I have like nothing in the foreground. It becomes a formal way to deal with what ultimately is kind of like this vertical stripe in the middle of the piece that almost doesn't have a spatial read, and it's that kind of scene between the Williamsburg and the Alexandria locations that also kind of serves as this bifurcation that will let you go to the left or the right in deep space, and then when you need to go to the other side, you can kind of backtrack into the foreground and then back again.
Is there some kind of commentary going on about the difference between Williamsburg and Alexandria in this picture?
I think there could be. There's kind of on maybe one level real differences in terms of light and space. So like as something that I think would appeal to other painters that deal with like interior, exteriors, landscape painters, still life painters. We can get really picky about like the quality of the light in different rooms. And when I was in Alexandria, I was kind of overlooking this canyon in Weston, Alexandria. I had a balcony on the 3rd floor, visibility going about 2 miles, floor to ceiling glass, and the studio was set up on this track in the inside of the living room. So there was this idea of like a huge amount of visible space, but there was also this huge amount of deciduous trees that was keeping a lot of strong light from ever getting into this place, except in the early morning because it was due east facing. So it was a very interesting kind of camera of a living room that would be like pink and orange and right around breakfast time. And then after that, it would just become this like panoramic view of what was outside. The inside became dark. In Williamsburg, and this is kind of sticking on the level of just what the light is doing, there tends to be just a lot more diffused light. You don't get to see as far outside. The inside is more interesting in some ways. The way light is bouncing around is more interesting. But also I think there's like this, you know, there's that formal level, and then there is something more emotional or a content idea. And those ideas will show up, and I tend to be kind of cryptic about them in the pieces at first if I'm uncomfortable with it. But they deal with more autobiographical things of how I feel about living in one space versus another, that almost become like a journal or a diary at times. So in that way, I would say the apartment in Williamsburg has a sense of something more solitary and monastic, and the one in Alexandria has a sense of increasingly something more just in memory.
Yeah. So how is it for you to come back to the place you did your undergraduate work after having lived in a pretty beautiful place,
Yeah.
really, something quite different? How is it to come back?
Well, I think Williamsburg is very beautiful. It doesn't have this kind of canyon view because nothing is more than 2 stories off the ground. But I still have a balcony. I'm still a story off the ground. I really like balconies a lot, actually. But this, of course, is like the first question anybody has asked me when I told people that I was going back to William and Mary. Is it strange? And it is a little strange. I'm very sensitive to any of the new construction projects, any of the renovations and anything. There was a painting I did in the foyer of this building, Andrews Hall, and there was a balcony in the foyer where the upper painting students were. This is where I decided I like balconies. And I did this really wide painting, panoramic painting of maybe about 100 degrees, 120 degrees view of the space. And since I finished that painting and graduated, it came back, they completely renovated that space. So there's always this duality of things that I knew very specifically about who was here, the kind of sense of atmosphere, formal qualities of the architecture and how the light worked. And those things have changed, so I'm kind of like coexisting in the memory of the place that was crystallized in my mind, and then how it is really now. And that's absolutely something that kind of is also happening in my painting practice. So yes, it's strange.
Yes.
It's strange to be back.
Well, I'm struck with this painting, how necessary it is for me as a viewer to hear this account, to get it.
Yeah.
I mean, the autobiography is really, really important for me with this picture. Is that the way your work generally works? That the story makes it come alive, or maybe, I mean,
right.
I'm thinking I may be, my ignorance may be such that other people would get access to a picture without the story. But
yeah, I mean, so the question is the into the painting or any other work of visual art that's kind of nonverbal perhaps, does it need this larger context? Does it need this
Yes.
backstory? And I think obviously you can get a lot out of this backstory. This is why when people go to museums, they'll read the cards with the paragraph explaining the context of the piece. They'll read the big thing on the wall at the beginning of the show. And now, of course, you have people that will have the little audio guides. So I think everybody benefits from having more context in visual art, but at the same time, I really hope that you don't have to have that context to be able to get into one of these paintings. My hope is that as much as there is this huge backstory, and that's kind of the underwater part of the iceberg that leads to the formation, that you can still just be attracted by some of these big ideas in terms of the formal ideas. And when that's worked really well, I can think of another painting that's actually somewhere else in the gallery right now, where at the reception for this show, they said, I don't really know anything about the context of this painting. It's this woman reclining on a couch, and there's a chessboard on the tabletop.
Can we move to
And
that?
we can move. Somebody at the reception says, I don't know anything about the context of this painting, but when I look at it, I've been looking at it for a while, it kind of caught my eye. I've been compelled to try to figure out what it's about. And I think this is important, that the way that you get somebody into a painting isn't by kind of hitting over their head with some kind of illustration of a content idea. You have to kind of pull them in with these formal elements. There needs to be these ideas of balance. There need to be ideas of focal points that kind of grab you. Because most people, in practice, they're kind of moving at about 2 or 3 feet a second through the gallery until something hits them, then they slow down, they walk up to it. And then when they get 2 or 3 feet from the painting, there needs to be something rich that they didn't see at 6 or 7 paces from the painting to keep them staying longer. And then content ideas, I think, really have a place. You need to already have the viewer's guard kind of down, and a level of engagement and interest. And then they get to that point where they're like, now I felt compelled to try to figure out what was going on in the piece. And so I think the student said, it seems like it's something about a disconnect. I started noticing what looked like an end game or like a checkmate in the chessboard, or something about the posture of the figure, the fact that she was looking away from the viewer, that she's in profile, that we can't even really get her eyes. So there were things that were really formal ideas, like I'm going to place this person this way at this angle. There's going to be these ideas of like sub-motifs in this still life, and the implication that it's because it's right right in front of the figure, that there's a connection between the two just because of the visual arrangement. So the formal elements get to these content ideas, and they said, so am I totally off? Am I crazy? Is it about any of those things? It seems like it's about some kind of disconnection. And I said, yeah, it is. This is a painting that is about, it's about a separation between me and my wife. Interestingly, when I started this painting, it wasn't even apparent to me that the separation was even going to happen. But in a weird kind of 2020 hindsight, there's something about the staging and the arrangement. All these things actually finished, the painting being done before it occurred to me. This is actually about these kinds of disconnects. The initial genesis of this painting was the fact that I was playing a lot of chess, reading a lot about different kind of chess opening moves, and I got really interested in the idea that you could have a white bishop and a black bishop, each on their own colored tiles, and they kind of exist in these parallel worlds, where when you play chess, if you lose your bishop on the black tiles and your opponent loses their bishop on the white tiles, those bishops are free to kind of move around and attack any of the other pieces, but they're kind of out of phase with each other. In the same domain, in the same space, but they can't actually, there's nothing for them to interact directly with each other, only indirectly. So I made an arrangement on a chessboard with these two bishops. I figured out what would be the largest still life around it, how would that fit in an interior. At one point it was just an empty couch, and I realized I needed a figure in that couch. So this is how my spouse got into it. And she's, you know, this was fortuitously kind of just the pose she picked. And then all of these ideas were starting with this kind of very abstracted content idea of what would it be like to have a world where like two agents that have a lot of interesting dynamic power have no way of ever connecting. And then I just went on trying to solve a whole bunch of formal problems until the painting felt balanced. It felt resolved. There was a kind of unity. And then I'm said and done. I walk away from it. And then later I can start to think, okay, what was it about as an idea? Beyond this initial kind of removed idea about chess. And so that's the way a lot of these paintings work. There is some kind of content idea, but it's not one that's kind of overtly autobiographical, not something that feels like it's really hitting me over the head. Then it becomes a challenge of working from perception, trying to actually respond to the specifics of things that are right in front of me in these studio spaces. Realizing from that point that I have to invent and rearrange the architecture, the arrangement of the still lifes, the furniture, putting models in. Purely kind of formal concerns that are based on how do I resolve the piece, as well as how do I not completely lose whatever that original content idea was. So this idea that the figure is not facing you, not making eye contact, even the articulation of the eyes aren't completely fleshed out. All that's kind of going back to the initial idea of like, how do you create an experience for the viewer where there's something there but you can't quite connect. Once I do all those things, then I kind of call it a day. And then usually in the months or weeks between that and when it has to go into a show, or when I finally have to give it a title, give it a name, then I start to think about like, okay, what was going on? So there's also a really kind of therapeutic role to painting in this way, because it's a really interesting kind of self-analysis without having to realize that that is what you're doing some of the time. And maybe another way of saying that is the spaces that we live in, the houses and the apartments that we furnish and arrange, and we pick to live in those places very often. We pick one apartment instead of another one, sometimes one town instead of another town. They become psychological extensions of our own character. And I think that's why, especially in the tradition of painting, there's always going to be this motif of the painter in his studio. And it becomes this kind of small universe where everything can be charged with a kind of personal meaning, because it could all be incredibly deliberate. Even the things that feel accidental now, in retrospect, could seem prophetic within a much larger context of looking at not just one painting or one day in the studio, but a larger work or a period of months or years. So all these other interests that I have in the world, they're in that apartment as well. They share that space.
May I ask about one feature of this painting?
Yeah.
I was struck first by the reclining figure's left arm, and it's kind of it's so big. It's sort of first that, then everything else.
Okay.
For me, and I was wondering if that's important, or if it's just an accident of my perception that was the first thing I saw and the thing I kept coming back to.
Well, there's maybe a little bit more foreshortening into that elbow and arm than would first appear. So there is that idea that within the context of that figure, that elbow is actually the thing closest to the viewer. So it could be that I actually kind of pushed that up a little bit. Now that I think about it, I think it actually really did have that kind of size difference. I don't think I embellished too much. Yeah.
It just seems big, and then I noticed the little barbell thingies on the table, and I think this is a muscular arm, and it's important. It seems important, but it may not be.
Well, those are her barbells, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's very important that this is a very strong arm.
Well,
for what could be, I mean, the reclining pose is the fainting couch.
Yeah.
It's the wispy, and then there's this arm, which isn't a wispy arm, but which goes with barbells.
So we've got a foreshortened arm, that's going to play up its muscles. We've got barbells, they're actually Dawn's barbells. We have the arm making a nice graphic V, kind of very close to the center of the composition, so that becomes very focal. At the very bottom of the elbow, we've also got the white bishops kind of right below it, so there's a nice kind of surface pathway where you can go right from the top corner, back corner of the chessboard, right into the figure. So it's like that one moment where like two things are so close that you can just jump between the foreground and midground. And even the idea that the arm is moving at diagonals when we're referencing bishops in a chess game, which again is about diagonals. So all of those things are like different layers of, why that placement of where that arm is in that configuration would be useful. Am I actually, like, when I'm painting these, thinking about like all of these half dozen criteria at the same time and going, really, you need to crook your arm like this? Perfect. Usually, it's more luck, and then if it works, I keep it. If it doesn't work, I paint it out. So there are other works in the show where there have been figures in it, and then it didn't work, and then the figures got completely painted out. Works like this, where initially there were no figures, I realized there was something lacking, I put a figure in, and I kind of lucked out that the pose worked with this stuff. So in many ways, I'm not so sly, not so tricky that I'm thinking about all of these things as it's happening, so much as I respond to what's in front of me, I put it down, and then I call it a day. I come in the morning, the afternoon, the next time, and then if it's working, I start to realize it's working. I say, okay, it's time to keep it, and if it's not, then I put something else in and I paint over. And so that's a very dumb process, actually.
Well, it's very helpful to know that you were influenced by Mondrian early on.
Yeah, yeah.
That for some reason that helps a lot. The floor, to my mind, looks a little round. Am I wrong? I mean, it feels like there's a slight curve.
Yeah, yeah.
What's going on with that?
So these are not some of the biggest paintings I've done, but one thing I really like is very wide spaces. This goes back in part to some of the things I was doing at the end of William and Mary, some of the things I was doing in grad school. In terms of space, I have like a soft spot for painters that deal with perspective, and I think of people like Rackstraw Downs, this painter who's now in Boston, Gideon Bach. They're not dealing with space where you're kind of, say for example, the camera we have right now, it's probably got something, it's a telephoto lens. If you zoom all the way out, you maybe get a 60-degree cone of vision. once you start taking on 90 degrees, once you get even to a panorama of something approaching 180 degrees, really wide panoramic views, that's when you get all these weird kind of curves, moments where the ground planes, especially in the corners, start to feel like they're tilting in weird ways, because you're physically having to move your neck, maybe even your torso, as you're trying to account for something you're looking at in the painting over here, and then you have to actually move your body to look at the thing on the far opposite side. So you have to imagine that if we got to about here, we would start to get to things like the foot of the easel. So we're very close to the model, and we're very close to something like this coffee table. When we get into something like the ground plane, that distortion is actually a reflection of the fact that you're so close that you almost have this kind of bubble view. And that is very often kind of surprising how much it can happen. But when you're working directly from observation and you're in a close space, these kind of things happen all the time. Some of my favorite kind of photography in the last 10 years has been the Mars rovers. And I love the 360-degree views of the Mars rover where, you know, and I actually have a book of some of these where they're like these pullouts that will be like 3 feet long, high-resolution images. They're probably compounds of like thousands of photos put together. And the Mars rover is always actually in these panoramas. Not the camera or the base coming from the camera, but like the top bed of it is always there. And it's a rectangle. The top bed of the Mars rover is a rectangle, but when you see the individual corners, you're going to see all 4 of them in 360 degrees. You get these curves like this. Because straight lines in that kind of panoramic setting, they have to start to curve. Now, if you make the picture big enough, and you're kind of close enough to the picture that you're only looking at maybe a 60-degree cone at a time, those curved lines seem pretty straight. And some of our ideas, conventional ideas about linear perspective, still seem to be holding true. It's when you try to see the whole thing at once, when you try to see more than that 60-degree cone and you start to zoom beyond that, then you start to become aware of how much the space is curving. And one of the things that's really fascinating, of course, is we actually see much wider than that. Our peripheral vision goes out a great degree, but most people, when they're processing the visual world, when they're actually like what they perceive, they're really looking at something very narrow that's right in front of them. And a lot of the things in the periphery, we're only sensitive to unexpected movement, large kind of changes in shape, a lot of the nuance in terms of do straight lines curve. We're not really even thinking about that because it doesn't have, it's not necessarily something very functional in the sense that I need to know how that works in order to walk around a room and not run into a wall. So most of us don't have to be good at seeing how these things curve. This is earlier in the video, I was talking about this idea that all these other interests that I have can exist in the space of an apartment or a painting studio. And I guess I was thinking, maybe that wasn't really clear. Maybe there would be an opportunity to have a better example of what that kind of means. And so I'm picking this as another kind of specific anecdote of some of these process ideas. And this is one where I think I took it a little further than I have in other pieces. And I'm kind of interested to continue to explore this way of working as much as I am something like the 50-50 of like different studio spaces. So after Fukushima in 2011, I started to devour everything I could, learn about nuclear power, some of the newer kind of small-scale nuclear power plants, the history of nuclear power plants, the fact that Fukushima was one of the GE kind of prototype designs, the same one that was in 3 Mile Island in the US that almost melted down, almost identical to to the one that was in Fukushima, because these were all kind of right at the beginning of post-war nuclear power construction. I watched quite a few interesting things on Chernobyl, and I started to think about that idea of like the contamination that can happen when nuclear power goes down. And also the idea that as much as nuclear power seems really scary, it's also potentially a lot safer in the long run than a lot of fossil fuels are. I mean, the amount of pollution that's being emitted in you know, tons and tons and tons by something like coal power, in terms of how many people die every year, is still nowhere near the worst case scenario for a lot of these nuclear power situations in some ways. So I have a true HEPA air filter. I have a few allergies. And I have a true HEPA Dyson vacuum cleaner. And so as I'm watching these videos on Chernobyl, I'm like 5 feet away from something that in a way reminds me of a constantly humming, will go on forever air filter. So if I'm worried about nuclear particles coming out of like Surrey power plant, because we're within one of the emergency zones of a nuclear power plant right here. This is the kind of thing that would actually, in theory, pick up some of those particles. Not really, but more in a kind of false sense of security and comfort. So I started thinking about the way that some of the anxieties I had about nuclear power, about my friends on the West Coast that were worried about like the jet stream actually carrying some of that radiation and contaminating crops on the coast of California. How at the same time I would be worried about moving into a new apartment that had a whole bunch of cat dander, and I needed this stuff to keep me from getting sick and getting hospitalized. So this is one of those ones where like the backstory starts to build. Then I'm watching James Cameron's Aliens. There are nuclear-powered atmosphere factories in James Cameron's Aliens. They're creating the atmosphere for a barren, rocky planet, and they're an important plot device because ultimately Ridley needs to cause a nuclear meltdown because one of these alien hives in the sci-fi movie is located really close to one of the nuclear cores, so if she can blow up one of these nuclear plants, she can kill the aliens. Of course, there's going to be no atmosphere in this planet, and if it is, it's going to be probably a lot of really radioactive isotopes. So I kind of like the idea of thinking about Fukushima, thinking about an air filter, thinking about this nuclear-powered clean air machine in Aliens, and how something that existed physically in my apartment, something that existed on the other side of the world in current events, and something that existed in the realm of pop culture and sci-fi, all of them maybe were more related than I had initially thought. And I was interested in making those kind of connections. And I wasn't below just getting a screenshot of James Cameron's Aliens on Netflix and then printing it out with an inkjet printer and just kind of sticking an image of that still of this thing just right on the floor. I kind of like the idea of open books with prints of other people's art or post-it notes or maps, just kind of like sticking them in the still life. And they become kind of a clue as to what some of the content ideas are. And again, this is not a new idea. Like you'll look at Vermeer interiors. He's constantly sticking prints and maps and paintings that are explicitly supposed to give you some of that context of whatever the rest of the piece is about.
Thank you.
Okay.